looking like breeze.
Hello, and welcome to the Anexinet Infrastructure Modernization Podcast. Here on AIM, we invite industry professionals and subject matter experts on to discuss current trends and technology topics. Today, we will be talking about Cisco's Modern Network Security with Drew Kaiser, Solutions Architect from TechData, who is a Cisco Specialist in the area of cybersecurity. Drew, how are you doing this afternoon?
I'm doing great, Chris. Thanks for having me.
So as we get started, can you just give a real quick rundown of, who you are, what you do, how you've gotten to the place that you're at?
I'm one of the solution architects specializing in Cisco cybersecurity over at TechData. I primarily got into security because I was dealing with it over at another company called NCR, where I was helping to secure a lot of customers around the local southeastern region and along the East Coast. So I've been dealing with security for about going on 10 years now. And I really enjoyed Cisco due to a lot of reasons. One, they had some of the best technologies in the field, and they started buying up more and more. And two, they ended up having a really open API system that was easily programmable and something that I could work with on a large scale.
And when you say work with on a large scale, you mean you actually had your hands in the muck?
I did. So we were able to deploy out, I think the largest deployment we did was a 50-site firewall. And we ended up having all of that scripted and being able to then utilize policies from a centralized management perspective. And we didn't have any issues along the way. So I was pretty proud of that one.
Pretty cool. So, Andrew, we've been running this little modern network security series for a couple of weeks now. Some important themes are coming up. Managed detection and response, or everything detection and response solutions, seem to be benefiting from artificial intelligence and machine learning capabilities, right? So that we're getting better at analyzing data and then spitting out actions, right? The second thing that we learned is that logging and our alerts are really only as good as the actions that they invoke. And when you're talking about cybersecurity and incident response and remediation, that obviously makes a lot of sense. And then the third kind of trend that we've heard through some of these recordings is, SOC and SIEM in conjunction with other preventative measures are pretty much useless unless they're monitored 24/7. And again, invoke action based on intelligence and intelligent decisions. So those are some of the trends that we've seen as we've been going through here. So we can, pick on those, or hopefully we'll add a few more. But, the topic at hand is really modern network security. And we're looking at it through a lens of what's happened over the past 12 or 16 months or longer, depending on how you want to look at the timeline. But, things like the SolarWinds breach, right? The SolarWinds Orion breach, and how that was that supply chain attack. Now we have Colonial Pipeline that's been in the news, and everybody's been, kind of up in arms about what happened there. So we're asking three basic questions, and I'm going to toss you the first one. What should companies be doing to monitor and control data that's leaving their organization? And this speaks directly to the SolarWinds Orion. Everybody was monitoring what's coming in, and they were very concerned about their perimeter. But, there was a ton of command and control that was going on, right, where the attackers were actually communicating with outside systems so that they could invoke remote actions of different kinds. And if they had just been, monitoring that communication leaving their organization, they probably would have been in a lot better shape, noticed it earlier, and been able to do things a little bit differently. So what do you think about that? And what do you think about people monitoring traffic that's leaving their organization? Where do you put that in your mind?
So that's a good question. I think especially for a lot of SMB or even middle market organizations, it's difficult to actually monitor on a large scale everything that's leaving your organization, because usually the IT teams aren't dedicated towards security. They're wearing multiple hats. They have various roles, and more than likely they're responding to one fire or another and trying to put it out. So I think this has also been complicated by encryption. Like Let's Encrypt did a great job of encrypting the internet, and now we're seeing over 75% of it encrypted. The bad problem with encryption is that it's a double-edged sword. So people can exfiltrate data with encryption. Ransomware is also a huge problem, and that's just encrypting a hard drive and then not giving you the password. So I see a lot of issues primarily around what we can do to protect key systems. And really, that just goes back to the fundamental security principles of segmentation, obfuscation, as well as ensuring that they are who they say they are when accessing systems. So there's a couple of Cisco solutions I like to talk about for that. Segmentation is just basically VLANs and making sure that you have separation inside of your networks. Now, if you wanted to do it inside of a application or a stack, you could easily do that for your development teams as well. That's a higher end solution called tetration. Now, for ensuring that the individual is who they say they are, that's where multi-factor comes in. And Microsoft does a good job with that for Office 365. I like Duo, and I use it on my LastPass. I use it on about 10 or so different applications now. And that's why I like Duo. It's application ubiquitous. So it interfaces very well and provides extra security for a lot of those applications. A lot of this is really trying to distill down where we can protect from supply chain attacks. And supply chain attacks are tricky. The SolarWinds incident wasn't just some guy with a laptop that decided he was going to go hack SolarWinds. I mean, this is a very well-funded organization that did incredible work to penetrate a very secure organization and then upload malicious payloads without detection. And this went on for a year plus. The timeline's a bit iffy, but some estimates are putting it back to September 2019. And it was discovered then in December, so almost a year after. And that really just shows the level of sophistication of some of these advanced persistent threats and these advanced actors. They have time, they have resources, and once they get the telemetry and know your systems, it's going to be very difficult to stop that. One of the solutions that I do like to see coming out of this whole thing is some of the projects from the Linux Foundation, SigStore. So that's actually where code signing is part of the development process. So you have various developers that are actually signing their code in order to verify it along that supply chain. So something like that is going to be needed going forward to really help secure against these supply chains. But even if you are infected with the supply chain, that's where segmentation helps. And multi-factor ensures that they're not going to be getting access to critical accounts and being able to pivot inside. So it's really that layered security approach that overall helps a small to medium business, even the large organizations as well.
So you said a bunch of interesting things there. You started out with segmentation, right? If you try to monitor everything leaving your network, that could be kind of a daunting task. But if you have a and what I think you were implying was if you have a well architected network security posture, right, with good segmentation, it becomes a lot more manageable to understand what your data flows are and what is supposed to be leaving your organization from where and what's not, right? Segmentation is not new, right? We've been talking about that for a long time. That's why part of the reason why VLANs exist is for, better broadcast domain control and better security and, like you said, network segmentation so that you can break things up into logical blocks for functionality purposes. But then also the tetration concept, right? So talk to us a little bit more about tetration and how that could help in scenarios kind of like this to understand what your systems are supposed to be communicating with and when and how it can help maybe highlight some things that might not be so good for the environment.
Secure workload or tetration, fundamentally, it's microsegmentation and it's a firewall for your app workloads. And so, for instance, if this was in place in SolarWinds, they would be able to see exactly what segment is talking to another inside of their applications. And its primary purpose is for workload protection. So for development teams or for any type of code base, making sure that workload is protected, as well as the virtual machines and the containers that run them.
And this may have been a misconception of mine. I thought tetration was really just about network monitoring. Does it actually have like policy and ACLs that are involved? Or if it's used in conjunction with other Cisco products, it can be more versatile?
Yes, so you're able to see forensics and vulnerability detection and a lot of north, south, and east, west traffic with that. So its primary purpose is around visibility and monitoring, but you have enforcement engines that can be tied with other security products like Cisco Identity Services Engine, and that's tie-in is through SecureX. So what you end up having is a alert that's brought up by detection, and then ICE that's actually the enforcer and stopping that from communicating any further.
So ICE would be a good kind of enforcement engine to pair with tetration then to get that higher level of control as opposed to just visibility. Is that right?
Absolutely. And ICE also pairs well with StealthWatch for that exact same reason. If you're looking at NetFlow, it also pairs with Umbrella if that endpoint is starting to go out to malicious sites. There's quite a few different pairings across the portfolio.
I was surprised you didn't bring up Umbrella actually in relation to the SolarWinds hack when I mentioned command and control. Because I remember when I was reading about the breach, that was the first thing that popped in my mind. I was like, man, if they had Umbrella, I can't imagine that they would not have seen that command and control activity much sooner than they did. At least that was my thought at the time.
So known command and controls are labeled by Talos. For SolarWinds specifically, I don't know if it would have been caught. The reason I say that is because they used a domain that was on the internet for 15 years and had no malicious sightings. How do you label that as command and control if it has nothing in its history that states as such? So being able to find out that is really difficult, and that's one of the reasons SolarWinds was so effective.
Gotcha. Interesting.
You've mentioned a couple of things, and I want to circle back really quickly, in particular around ICE and in particular around Talos. Can you talk about how Cisco products help in the sense of building these examples, in the sense of building a fingerprint of malicious intent and helping, one customer anonymously helps another because everything is so centralized?
Sure. I'm a little confused by the question. So
think about it like crowdsourcing, right? Because everything is as a service, right? We're, software as a service, product or platform as a service. What we've been hearing is there seems to be the impression that because multiple customers are leveraging common platforms, there are larger aggregations of data and data sets, and security vendors think that that's a good thing because they're able to draw conclusions faster because they have larger sample sizes. And then that, helps identify bad actors and potential threats faster. That's what we're hearing. We wanted to kind of get your opinion on the topic.
So absolutely. If you look at like OpenDNS or Cisco Umbrella, it's seeing upwards of 175 to 180 billion DNS requests a day. That's telemetry that it's going to be using. And Talos is also ingesting 600 billion plus emails a day through their email security appliance. They're ingesting all the next generation firewall telemetry. They're ingesting all the ANFR endpoint telemetry as well. What I think does make these organizations even more powerful is being part of an alliance and that free sharing of information. It doesn't necessarily need to be one intelligence versus another. So if you're both on the side of securing everyone, it helps. And that's where I think something like the technical alliance helps and is really something that is needed for a lot of top threat intelligence organizations across the world. Basically, yes, it does help.
Yeah, good. At least we're getting some consistency across our cyber experts. That's always positive. It's never good when 3 or 4 people are saying different things. What else you got, Chris? You got any other questions?
No, I'm basically done with them.
Oh, God.
No.
All right.
One of the questions that I would like to ask, and this is something I think that is helpful, is we have this philosophy that every business is equal in terms of needing protection. But every business might not necessarily think that they need enterprise level protection or like several $100,000 a month type of protection. When you look at potential customers and the way that you can secure them, what are some of the things that go through your mind about how to protect a small company versus a medium versus a large company?
A lot of the principles of security are really around just reducing risk. And it's saving money in the long run for both a small, medium, and large business if they're able to identify where their risk is coming from and then have solutions or practices in place to mitigate or hopefully, well, you can't completely eliminate, but get it as close to elimination as possible. And that's really where we see a difference between some of the small, medium, and large businesses is just where their risk is coming from. So a lot of the small to medium businesses, fundamentals are incredibly important. Just making sure patch management is up to date and everything is in line with that. Two-factor, also very important, making sure everyone is who they say they are on the network. Those are some very crucial things that help secure a lot of small businesses everywhere. And also, these don't have to be expensive. I mean, one of the best security controls, in my opinion, is NAT, and it's free. It's part of IP. It obfuscates hundreds of thousands of addresses behind a single IP. And so something like that is incredibly useful. There's a whole bunch of open source resources and things that small businesses can really leverage to shore up their security. But there's also cheaper solutions too, like Duo and Umbrella are two that come to mind. Umbrella is very cost effective and it's protection that is both available on network and off network. So you can unify a lot of your security policies through that. Duo provides visibility into the endpoints. It also provides that multi-factor, not just for Office 365, it provides it across hundreds of applications. So being able to utilize both those in tandem is going to make your passwords more secure, which is going to make breaking them harder. And it's also going to ensure that your users are protected both on network and off network.
Duo was exactly what was in my mind when I asked the question because, and I am speaking in the Anexinet we here, we have done the two most recent deployments of Duo. One was for a company that had a total employee count of 5. And the next one coming up is one that has a total employee count of several thousand. So the idea that MFA is too expensive for a small company or is too ungainly for a small company, I think, especially with tools like Duo, that argument against security kind of starts to lose some steam.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think I've talked about it a few times, but there have been multiple organizations that I've talked to who really aren't keen at looking at their fundamentals, and they want the biggest, the best solution because that's what's going to protect them. Scaling that back into isolating down where your risk is and, just showing them how easy a password is to break. I mean, all you have to do is get a hash and a couple of graphics cards, chug away at it for a little bit, and it breaks if it's around 8 characters. So the computing has just gone through the roof. And that really shows people how important it is to have that second factor or something else to augment passwords, because most breaches are either patch management issues or password issues. And then if you get into the larger organizations, there's issues in software development as well. And that's really the dividing line, in my opinion, between the small, medium, and the large enterprises. If they're doing their own software design, then they're really getting into like CI, CD, or secure OpEx or DevSecOps.
Yeah, it's actually funny. We haven't really talked a lot about secure DevOps. It's so funny they decided to put the dev in front of the security. I'm not sure why, but it's, secure DevOps is really where we're all trying to get to.
It's because developers thought of it first.
Probably. This whole concept of supply chain attacks, and we live in a digital age, right, where we've minted more millionaires in recent history than over some ridiculously large span of time, and a lot of it is all around software development, right? And so here we are, we're talking about cybersecurity, and we can all see the news and the threat feeds and the breach feeds and everything else, that there's all kinds of crazy stuff going on. People are just being breached all the time, whether they know it or not. We only hear about it when they find out about it, right? It used to be, and it still is, I think, to some extent, getting people to run static code scans and then actually go back and resolve vulnerabilities that were in their code and getting those pushed into production or through the backlog was a bad enough pain in the neck, let alone doing dynamic testing, right, where you're actually executing at runtime and looking, that was like every developer's worst nightmare. Don't look at my code while it's running. You know what I mean? They hated every second of it. Well, we don't have time to do that. We'll just do static scans. It was like, okay, really? And then organizations bought into it. There were, leaders that were like, all right, fine. As long as you run a static scan, fine. We'll and you resolve everything that's critical, high, and medium. We'll let you move it to production. But now we're in these days where that's not even remotely good enough, right? So we want to start having people check in code. Like, you have a certificate on your machine, you write a piece of code, you do your unit testing, you sign your code, and then, yeah, fine, we'll let you now push it into the development stream right before it moves up the rest of the chain. It's almost like MFA and table stakes at this point for me if you're doing custom development. And I just feel like it's not getting the level of attention and traction it should. What do you think about that, Andrew?
No, I 100% agree with that. We've seen some increases in secure programming languages like Rust, for example, just because of that. And I think a lot of the OWASP proactive controls really go around making sure you're protecting earlier and earlier in the development lifecycle. And if you're stopping these problems before they happen, you're saving millions down the line. I mean, who knows how bad some of these could be if they're not caught early enough.
Yeah.
Could be the next SolarWinds.
Well, I think that's kind of the well, I don't want to say fear, but I think that's the reasonable assertion that we're trying to get people to be aware of, right? Is that it really doesn't take much for you to be that next company that ends up in the news. There's like this weird dichotomy almost, people spend all this money on cybersecurity, but they're spending all the money in the wrong places because they're only thinking about the most obvious attack, right? It's just like if I'm trying to secure my house, where am I going to go first? I'm going to go look at doors and windows. All right, well, great. Well, once I get the doors and windows covered, or I put better locks on the doors, well, what about the door frame? It's still made of plywood and 2x4s, right? And it's held together with nails and caulk. So if my frame is still crummy, no matter how secure I make that door, they're still going to get around. And I kind of feel like that's how people think about cybersecurity. They're very focused on the perimeter. Well, there's a lot of stuff that's in that perimeter and that gets through that perimeter that's supposed to get through. How are you still going to stop the bad guys if you're not paying attention? And if you don't have visibility and you're not hyper vigilant and you're not paying attention and you're not looking for it, then you're probably going to get smacked. And that's just perimeter. We haven't even started talking about code and then their supply chain and all these other things. But people need to start thinking like a criminal as opposed to trying to think like a good guy, just trying to keep the criminals out, because that's never going to work.
No, I agree. And I think some of the most effective criminals are ones that, honestly, have already worked at that organization too and have those credentials. So an insider threat is a very real possibility for a lot of organizations as well. So you never know. And that's really the defense in depth or the multi-layer security approach that is talked about all over, because if you're able to block them at one point, then it stops them from proliferating and spreading throughout the network.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point because, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm going off the top of my head here, but I believe that 70% or something like that of attacks are actually instigated by people that are either employees or have access to the inside. So to Dave's point, you can spend as much time as you'd like securing your windows and your doors, but if it's your Uncle Steven, who is the one that's putting all the silverware into his wife's purse, it doesn't really matter how much you spent on those doors and windows.
That reference felt really personal.
I don't know what you could possibly mean. No, I think this takes us all the way back to what we started this conversation with, which is exfiltration and how important it is to know who is who, what are they accessing, and where are they taking that information.
Well, I think you just gave us our fourth pattern kind of information that has been discussed in this topic, and that is identity. So, it has to be more than one for a pattern, right? So we did talk about this with our friends at Ping, and obviously they're very focused on the identity space, but we've talked about identity a lot here as well. Identity, authentication, and authorization are crucial, and we brought it up through the means of MFA, and challenging that identity, right? So that you make sure that person needs to get what they want to get. So, but you're both right. So you have a person who's an internal bad actor. Well, they have an identity and they have an MFA, all of which we will accept because they're allowed to authenticate and then be authorized to access resources on the network. But, let's keep that person from moving laterally where they don't need to move. And that becomes, more about role-based access control. Something that simple. We're back to table stakes, right? In this day and age, you have to have a digital identity in order to access information. Your digital identity needs to be protected. You need to have a good password. You need to be challenged with multi-factor authentication because passwords can just be cracked so easily. And so many people are guilty of not using good passwords. But then looking at things like authorization, what are they supposed to have access to? And what are we going to do when someone tries or accesses information that they're not supposed to have? And I think that's that next step, that level of maturity that a lot of people are missing. If they can't conquer role-based access control or conquer it effectively, the chances of them being able to, alert and monitor effectively on unauthorized access or suspicious unauthorized access is going to be almost impossible. And we're back to table stakes. You've got to solve the table stakes, the due care, as I call it, right? People like to say table stakes, but it's got to be due care, just a minimum level of responsibility for understanding what it takes to run a digital organization. And then you can look at maturity from there. But I think we're in a day and age where we can't just do due care and table stakes anymore. We have to be pushing for maturity, automation, leveraging our artificial intelligence and machine learning, larger data sets through software as a service, platform as a service. Bringing all of those things together is where I see the future just has to go. Otherwise, we're never going to be able to keep up, if not ever even get ahead of the bad guys.
I agree. We need to go beyond due care and due diligence and just not say what we're liable for, but really go towards something that's like a zero trust architecture, whereas you're able to see exactly who's on the network and limit their access to only what they need. And that way you stop any type of spread. If an unknown device comes on, then stop it at its source. Don't even give it access. That's really where we need to head because there's too many things that get through the perimeter, like you said, David. And the perimeter is disappearing. Everything's going to the cloud. People are working remote. The perimeter is not as well defined as it used to be. And that's really where a lot of these new solutions, DNS protection through Umbrella, as well as Duo, ensuring that you have the user base protected, and also your identity and access management are crucially important to protect everyone.
I almost feel like we've almost come to the conclusion or the consensus between the three of us that like zero trust is really where it's at, right? If you don't have a zero trust network in this day and age, and don't get me wrong, with the associated risk profile that warrants it, right? You're really not providing due care is what I feel like we just said.
I would agree. Just because the modern network's complicated and zero trust seems to be the best model to help prevent that.
So what does Cisco have on the truck in terms of zero trust or helping drive, zero trust networks? What's in their wheelhouse that can help with that adoption?
Cisco has quite a few different options. Really, zero trust goes back to workforce, workplace, and workload protection. And these are solutions we've already talked about already. Securing that workforce is done primarily with Duo. Securing the workplace or all the devices connected to your network, including IoT and fish thermometers and everything else that are connected. That's really where either SD Access or Cisco's Identity Services Engine, ICE, come into play for ensuring that the devices only get access to what they need. And then securing the workloads. So all the connections within your apps across multi-cloud, that's where tetration comes in. And it really helps to protect not only your apps and services, but your databases and your virtual machines as well.
So it's funny that you said fish thermometers. If somebody kills my son's fish because they mess with the thermometer, I might actually have to go to war. Like, it would be a big deal. My son loves his fish.
Yeah, on the other hand, though, the fish knows what it did.
Oh, dear.
Yeah, the reason I mentioned fish thermometers. There was actually a breach where someone hacked into a IoT thermometer sitting in a lobby, wasn't part of the organization at all, and then managed to pivot all throughout the organization, and they got infected with ransomware. So I was like, how do you protect against that? Well, you stop the devices that are just coming on in droves. I jokingly refer to IoT as the Internet of Terrible because it is terrible for security. But these devices are just coming on and they're not maintained, they're not managed, sometimes they're not even patched, and they're causing issues. So segmenting them out is the best thing we can do.
I think you bring up a great point, and one that we need to discuss in a little bit more detail. People have no qualms about creating devices on their network. For example, the thermometer that you're talking about, or a thermostat on the wall, or a refrigerator that has a connection to the internet.
Alexa.
And exactly, as long as they're inside of your network, then the casual security attitude is, we're still fine. They're inside of our network. But really what they are is kind of a rogue actor that can be compromised, can be used as a launching point for far more damaging attacks inside of whatever significant and substantial security gates that we put on the outside of an organization.
Yeah, I was. It's funny that you said that because I was literally just about to say, look at all the Echo and Google and Apple devices that are out there, just sitting in people's homes, collecting all kinds of privacy. And I think everything is about demand, right? And I think fear of cyber incidents, whether it's at home or in business, it does create demand. But obviously that fear isn't at a level that's commensurate to the risk that's out there in cybercrime today. Otherwise, I don't think all these IoT devices and the current landscape of cybersecurity protection would be in the condition that it's in today. I really think that there are a lot of people out there that don't take it as seriously as they should. And, as much as people go on about privacy, how concerned about your privacy can you be given what we know about, Alexa and its recording capabilities and targeted ads and other things? So I think the demand is there because there is a modicum of fear and lack of understanding about how.
What I heard was you have a Target coupon. No, I think philosophically, this is an interesting question or an interesting thing for people to think about. And it comes down to identity. And the identity doesn't just have to be a human being, right? You have an identity that is a thermostat. You assign certain expectations to that identity as to what they can and should be doing. And if they do something outside of that, you alert on it. So, for example, if your thermostat is now all of a sudden interrogating your internal database of personal information, that's a problem.
Absolutely. What we see a lot of the time is a printer that's doing IP spamming or profiling and just seeing what's out there. Why is a printer doing that? Probably shouldn't be. And you see a lot of this in organizations too, because it's unfortunately not just at home where we see IoT devices. You see them inside the industrial space. You see them inside the security space too. There's some camera that just got breached not too long back. It was a Chinese company, but they went out of business. I mean, no one was patching or maintaining it. Someone found a vulnerability and there's no one to fix it. I mean, how does that even get in, or do you have to rip and replace at that point?
So here's an interesting story. Since we're into the anecdote part of the show, here's an interesting one. Very interesting possibility that the whole Colonial Pipeline thing might, even though the Russians somehow got thrown out there as a possible source of the attack. Apparently, the whole concept that the pipeline went down automatically enacted an emergency response to where oil trucks had to leave from the United States cache, if you will, where we keep our reserves, right, to go and distribute so that it didn't cause a national incident of some kind. And who has a satellite that flies over our every 90 minutes over the continental United States? So was it really to disrupt the pipeline, or was it just so that they could figure out where the cache was? I thought that was kind of an interesting little sidebar on the Colonial Pipeline attack.
And we will be talking about this in depth in our geopolitical conspiracy theory podcast.
Hey, man, I'm a cyber guy. I'm supposed to think like it could happen, right?
It absolutely could. I mean, this probably isn't the podcast to get into it, but it's happened in the past, both for and against the United States, and I'm sure it will in the future. You can cut that part out if you want.
Oh no, we're leaving it. We're going to make you look as devious as possible.
Perfect. It's the Anexinet Infrastructure Modernization / Nationalist podcast.
Let's end with a little bit of a lightning round here. When you talk to customers and the idea of security comes up, what are the first few things that come up as questions, and what are the first answers that you have for those customers?
First question is, how are you protecting against vulnerabilities? Second question is, well, what are your main risks? And then if you're able to isolate down your risks, how are you protecting against those or mitigating them? And then third question is, how are you protecting your users that are throughout the world now in a modern enterprise?
Yeah, and that last one in particular feels like it has a lot of value, in particular because people have been spending a ton of time working from home. We still have this like hybrid environment as we get away from COVID. I think the reality is that people are going to be working regardless of geography. So how do you protect an organization where their workforce is not in building X? They are literally spread across, the lower 48.
And you have to have a cloud that's a beachhead for your entire organization. You have to have somewhere on the internet that is a safe place for all of your remote users, IPsec tunnel traffic to terminate to, and that policy can be applied to. It's where Umbrella helps.
Can you just spend a real quick second, just maybe for my own personal education, but just in case people don't know, what exactly is Umbrella? Where do you install it? How does it fit into supporting and securing an entire organization?
Sure. So Umbrella is the open DNS protection, rebranded under Cisco Umbrella. And its primary purpose is to protect against DNS threats. So it's not adding any latency. It's a DNS resolver, but it is protecting against known malicious threats and also command and control. It also has elements of crypto mining protection in there and selective proxy that can then look at file and check the hash if it's known malicious as well. In addition, Umbrella recently got a facelift upgrade and had the secure internet gateway added to it. So SIG is starting to build into the idea of a beachhead for your organization out there on the public internet. Somewhere where you have a cloud-delivered firewall, you have a secure web gateway. The cloud-delivered firewall is inspecting all other ports besides your DNS port. And your secure web gateway is then looking at those ports 80 and 443 and taking a very granular look at the applications and everything that's running through those. Then everything is applying policy in order to protect users throughout the world.
I think this is worth spending a second on, because one of the things that you can do with this kind of protection, for example, if somebody was to get a malicious email with a URL that they could click on, if an organization had Umbrella, even if the person clicked on that link, because it was DNS level protection, it wouldn't go to the malicious website.
Correct. And you can actually get Umbrella on your home network too. You just redirect your DNS. 208.67.222.222 is the primary, and then the secondary is 208.67.220.220. And we have millions of homes that are using that for just base protections. So if a no malicious site is ever clicked by their kids, their loved ones, grandparents, they're protected.
I feel like a kid in school. I get a gold star. I have it configured on mine.
A+.
Every time I get a router or anything, it's the first thing I do is go and configure the open DNS.
I send mine directly to Moscow. Is that bad?
Sure, probably.
Dave, do you have any final questions here?
We covered a lot of really good material. I think we added to our list of kind of common themes that we're hearing across the conversation, which is great. We had a lot of overlap. So I think we're really building a strong case about, what modern network security really means. I was actually kind of pleased to hear the way the conversation went around zero trust. The fact that due care and due diligence doesn't really mean the same thing today that it used to mean. I remember when multi-factor authentication was kind of a new thing, right? And a lot of people just thought it was a nice to have. And now we're at the point where if you don't have multi-factor authentication, you're like 100 times more likely to get breached than people that have multi-factor authentication. Obviously, that doesn't still fix, that doesn't fix things like vishing or phishing or spear phishing, right? It doesn't fix insider threats necessarily, and those are a little bit more complicated. But we've definitely come to the conclusion, the perimeter security is not enough. We live in a world now, especially with things that have happened since 2020, where we have a fuzzy perimeter, and it's a very distributed workforce, a very distributed enterprise. We're already seeing companies embrace hiring practices where they're no longer tied to specific geographies because they know people are going to work remote, and that's just, it's more acceptable today than it ever has been in the past. And so the whole idea of zero trust and multi-factor authentication, controlling identities, getting the right tools in place, like multi-factor authentication, Umbrella, some kind of DNS protection that will at least provide you a little bit of internet filtering, just a lot of really good conversation. I think we're starting to draw some really good conclusions for our listeners.
Drew, do you have any final thoughts or things you want to talk about before we close up shop?
I think Dave covered most of the important points. I was like, oh yeah, I want to talk about this. Oh, nope, he got it. Oh, this is a good thing to bring up. Oh, nope, he got that too. So I do think I would say just to add on to Dave's coverage, my conclusion, make sure you're patching. It's more important than ever. These threats get turned around within days, and make sure you're protecting your users. Those are the two important things, because without the users, most organizations aren't going to exist. So that's what matters.
All right.
Okay, Drew, Dave, I think we covered it. I think we solved all the world's problems. Until next time, thank you guys for your time.
Drew, we really appreciate it, man. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.
All right, take care.
Bye, guys. Bye.
Look at like